All right, that is up and running. Any last minute questions? No turning back now. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off, and I'm going to mute myself, and I'll do that once I actually start it. But otherwise, if you need anything, yeah. Okay, I'm showing 2, so I'm going to go ahead and mute and then open up the broadcast.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it just a minute as people join us before we get started. Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Melissa Bertolo, and on behalf of Welcoming America, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Engaging the Community to Inform the Way Forward. At Welcoming America, we provide content and information that supports the work being done across the country, and our webinars are just one way we do that. If you are a network member, you can access past webinars and other resources by going to welcomingamerica.org/learn/resources. And from there, you can search by type, topic, and keyword to find the resources you need. I'm excited today to introduce our speakers joining us from Polco and the National Research Center. We have Matt Fulton, the Vice President of National Engagement, and Michelle Kobayashi, Senior Vice President of Innovation. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please enter them into the chat feature on your screen. We'll make every effort to answer all of your questions. And so it's now my pleasure to turn things over to Matt to start today's presentation.
Well, thanks, Melissa, and welcome, everyone. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. We'll be discussing a little bit about a partnership that we've just developed with Welcoming America, and so this opportunity is really something that we're looking forward to. And let me just start off by just acknowledging that we are all living through a very challenging time, aren't we? You know, it's difficult enough to build communities during normal times, but then when you add on COVID-19 and economic recessions and devastating impacts on municipal budgets, the building racial tensions and the uneasy relationships with police departments, and then you layer on top of that all of the issues relating to working remotely and remote meetings and transitioning from one to the other. I mean, it's just a tough time all around. But at the core of our responsibilities, it really is a privilege to be involved in the critically important role of just building communities where people want to live and invest in. Because people can live and invest generally wherever they like. Everybody wants to be in a place where they can be proud of and feel part of. And we all know that the work that goes into building communities takes an extraordinary amount of patience, persistence, and of course, it's all based on having trust. I spent 30 years as a city manager, and it really made me appreciate that everything a community does in one way or another is connected to everything else a community does. And the things and the services that are provided directly connect to serving people in some way. We impact people's lives every day in everything that they are involved with. And so it made me critically sensitive to recognizing the importance of having a sense of belonging to a community and thinking about how you can go about making people feel part of a community. I was also regularly reminded that when you think about communities lasting forever, the decisions and the things that happen in a community are really legacy decisions and will impact the community for decades. So it's really important that you get it right. I know that we probably all have been involved with decisions that weren't in alignment where local stakeholders wanted the community to go, especially as we're witnessing now. It's a very painful process when residents don't feel connected to the community's decision-making process or don't feel like their voices are being heard. Building and sustaining effective engagement with residents isn't easy, and it needs to be a core organizational value and not simply something that's viewed as a project. I'm going to switch the slide, Anthony. Can you go to the next one, please? You know, communities are beautifully complicated and diverse. And if we don't pay enough attention to how the value of its residents are being met, communities can easily be fractured and broken. And then it literally takes generations to correct. When residents feel underheard and undervalued, they really do lose trust and faith in their local leadership and respond in ways that are destructive, disruptive, and damaging, totally against building a strong or a vibrant environment. There's a saying in the city management world that well-run local governments can give people the privilege of not paying attention to the daily things that are happening in the community. Engagement happens when there's a crisis or when something great is happening and people want to be connected. And in between those two extremes is kind of a hit and miss. And during my career, after bringing bureaus more times than I'd like to mention, in what I thought was a well-run organization, I gained a great appreciation of just how wrong this statement is. And over the course of the last couple of decades of my time as city manager, shifted as much as I could to neighborhood levels because that's where people were most personally connected. You know, if you don't undertake the effort to find ways to authentically engage, you're going to lose, people will not have the ability to gain a context for how the community operates and in the ways that the community serves the public good. And then when something tragic happens, that's when people shift into crisis mode and the community life is totally disruptive. People are interested in what's going on in the community. I would suggest that you go into a coffee shop, at least when you can, and listen to the conversations that are going on around the room. Don't be surprised that you'll be hearing about local issues in some form, because I really do believe that people are interested in building a strong quality of life. The key is to pay attention to making engagement work. Next. As I mentioned earlier, engagement can't be considered to be a project. It really needs to be an organizational value and an expectation that will become part of your culture and your reputation. Someone recently shared an analogy with me and said engaging the community is like exercising. You know you need to do it. You know you'll feel better afterwards. And you have to keep at it or you'll lose your progress. You just need to go after it and keep going. You know, when you think of communities and organizations that are successful over time, you'll find that they probably have got a strong engagement program as a core value, and they have the systems in place to make sure that it's successful and sustainable. There's no doubt that engagement leads to smarter decisions because there are systems designed to help you respond to evolving community values and demographics and expectations. And we all know that those things are changing all of the time. It's having the continual awareness of understanding how residents feel about topics that allow them to be better connected to the community. You know, the successful engagement also helps to provide a context around the issues, which then also intends to provide an overall, a higher level of overall trust in the community because they have a context to put things into. And of course, you know, the best time to develop an engagement strategy is not when there's a crisis going on. Think about all the issues that you're dealing with around COVID-19 or some of the recent activities over the last couple of months. Do you have a good engagement program in, or are you reacting to things that are coming to you like a fire and you wish you would have had better engagement? I think that everybody's looking at that is listening and looking at this slide will appreciate all of the civic engagement objectives and design principles that we're showing here. I think we all recognize that good governance comes from having a good understanding of the values of the community. We all appreciate, and we probably all want, greater participation, and we certainly want to make sure that we're informing folks so that you have informed participation. Data-informed decisions is something that really is important, and it's not that difficult to get data or to find the data necessary to help inform decisions. And so as you think about engagement, what are you doing to help be data-driven in that decision-making process? Communities are now paying more attention to performance management. You know, as you think about accountability and transparency, we probably are, particularly now, more sensitive to it. I mean, just think about the importance of being accountable and transparent as you're going into budget cycles later on this year, or maybe you're in the middle of it right now. You just need to have that connection with your taxpayers so that when you make the difficult decisions that we're all probably going to be needing to make, at least relating to budget issues, they're able to put it into a context and certainly feel as though they've had an opportunity to be heard. Next. So as you start to think about your overall engagement needs, think about what you're trying to achieve. And it ranges. Are you looking for just getting a general sense of where people's heads are on a particular topic and you just want to have an ongoing engagement practice? Maybe there's a project that you've got going on, and so you want to get specific questions and input on how to design that project or how that project's going to impact the community. Maybe you're crowdsourcing ideas and trying to uncover new ideas. Or you may be wanting to use engagement for formal performance assessment. The key about that is to track your progress over time on things that you're doing as a community. You know, every issue and every community has got the issues that will benefit from engagement. The more important aspect, at least based on our recommendations, is to consider how you can engage residents along that entire journey, because residents want to feel like they're connected and they're engaged. So think of a project that's coming up and engage people at that point. And then while the process is going on and the decision making is occurring, engage people on their ideas. The more that you can do of engaging residents along the journey of a project or a decision, the more connected those folks are going to feel to the community and to that particular project. It will increase their level of pride in the community. And when you have an increased level of pride, just think of the impact on trust in the leadership of the community, as well as the resiliency that that provides. It doesn't need to be on every decision, but be strategic in thinking about what matters in the community and where the community voices are going to be helpful. Next. You know, we all know the typical ways that we engage with our respondents, from town hall meetings to just looking for resident comments, holding focus groups. You know, the difficulty with that is we know that attendance at those types of traditional ways typically isn't as successful as we'd like. From one of our national databases regarding resident opinions and behavior, we know that in most communities, fewer than 20% have ever attended a public meeting. Some communities, it's lower than 10%. And I don't think any of us should think that attendance at meetings is going to increase, and particularly now when we're all working remotely. You know, what is the impact, and how have your communities been impacted by the lack of just really opportunities to engage in any kind of a real meaningful way? At Polco, which is a web-based technology platform, we recognize the value and power of using the technology to build the engagement. If it's done correctly, it can bring a larger group of people to the table. Because it's a web-based application, we're able to provide additional demographic data, which is great in understanding the sentiments of how various neighborhoods feel, or how demographic subgroups are being impacted on any particular item. It's helpful to know that if something is impacting neighborhoods differently, or if the perspectives vary by demographic backgrounds. I mean, think about those folks who show up at your meetings and you really don't know if the issues that they're talking about impact the entire jurisdiction, or if it is really something that is specifically limited to a particular area. This knowledge really does help a great deal when you're starting to think about how to allocate resources to deal with it, or the best way to respond to the issue. The barrier has been just the limitation on being comfortable around technology. But as residents become more comfortable with technology and organizations start to recognize the value and the benefit of it, engaging online is going to become very convenient and very helpful and really help to build engagement. It doesn't replace other forms of engagement that you need to be paying attention to. And Michelle will talk about some of those later because different population groups may require different forms of engagement. But technology is certainly going to be something that is going to help engagement going forward. Next. So listen, we'd like to hear from you. Use the chat box and just respond to these two questions. When you're thinking about your operations in your organizations, who are those folks that you typically hear from? Or secondly, who do you have a hard time reaching right now? If you just want to take a minute and share your thoughts, we'd appreciate it. Our answer to that question is everyone. Remember, less than 20% of folks we find have attended meetings. And so we want to be engaging with everyone. Next.
Oh, and I was just going to read a couple of we've gotten a couple of answers very quickly.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'll go ahead and read those because some of them are just coming into us as the panelists. Anthony, could you back? Thank you. So for this question, who do you typically hear from? People who are already engaged in the issue. And then hard time reaching, we have people with limited English proficiency, especially hard to reach desired audiences, people that they don't already serve. Undocumented immigrants is another group people are having a hard time reaching. Typically hearing from people with immediate needs and concerns, harder time reaching people with limited tech literacy, typically hear from community leaders, but more difficult to have to reaching those at risk. One more, and then I'll hand it back over to you, Matt. Okay. Typically hear from the already convinced and having difficulty reaching recently arrived refugees. And just one more around the technologically literate piece, particularly related to senior citizens. So I think that's kind of come up a couple of times. Thanks. Yep. Thanks everyone for participating.
Yeah, thank you very much. But there's going to be some time at the end where we'll hopefully be able to address some of those comments that have been made. Want to switch the slide, Anthony, please? Thank you. So as I was mentioning, we feel that who are the hard to reach, and that's just everyone. We need to find ways to engage people in a more effective way. Next slide, please. So there's no question that we're living in a disruptive time as it relates to civic engagement. You know, just think about the impacts on public trust, some of the political dialogue that is going on. It just really makes people question things that are going on around the world and in America specifically. Lack of civil behavior that we're seeing occur. All the changes that are going on with technology, which can be a very good thing, although it seems as though people are more focused in on their technology than not. The media cycle, the just life cycle that we're all living in, people are on a 24-hour kind of a cycle right now, and it just is a totally disruptive kind of an experience. We are all busy. All of our schedules are busy, and unfortunately, the way the cities are structured aren't really very complementary to the ways that people are engaging right now. A lot of times, meetings are intimidating and sometimes overwhelming, and so we just need to be conscientious about that and think about the ways that we can correct that. Next slide. We do know that when you reduce the barriers to engagement, you're going to have better engagement. By lowering the barriers, you're going to be able to balance out the voices that you're hearing and get a much broader and deeper amount of involvement by folks. So as you think about your own engagement practices, what are the things that you can do to reduce the barriers? As I mentioned, city meeting times, when you're meeting around dinner time, when people are occupied with their families and not interested in getting to a meeting or not able to get to a meeting. The structure of the meeting, how intimidating that environment can sometimes be. Just recognize that by lowering the barriers, to that engagement, you'll be able to involve more participants from all segments of your community, and to help balance those voices that you're currently hearing from. Next. At Polco, we actually use something that we call an action plan, and I'll be more than happy to get this to Melissa to share it with all of you. It really is just kind of a boilerplate approach to helping you build a plan, launch engagement, and then keep engaging. The key elements of that is to think about who all of your outreach partners are as you're thinking and building a plan. Who are those folks that are leaders in your different demographic subgroups? Who are those different jurisdictions that you typically engage in, or those thought leaders in the community that you always can go to? Then launch your plan, and the way Polco works is you push out any questions that you have through all of your communication networks, and then all of the responses are gathered in an easy to read dashboard. And then as you pursue and promote and continue on engaging, keep that engagement process going on. The idea behind the way Polco is designed is to help you build an engagement panel, so that as you become a subscriber onto the platform, every time there's another item that comes up that the community wants to be talking with you about or getting your input, you'll get reminded about that on your email or by your mobile device. It becomes a very easy way to start building a panel up over time, so that you build it and you build it and you build it, and build this into your communication strategy that you have for as one component of your overall communication effort, because you'll be getting to a different segment of the population, and certainly part of the population that you're currently not hearing from. Next. This is actually a dashboard view of some of the information that's available when you engage on the Polco platform. The nice thing about it is that it's a real-time tool that can provide you, can verify and separate out your residents from all of the respondents. Anybody can respond and participate, and you certainly want to have that participation, but having the ability to separate out folks who are, who are your residents, allows you then to get information down to the neighborhood level. You can break out demographic data like ages, educational level, gender, income decile, all sorts of different demographic pieces of information. And why this is important is it allows you to not only understand how an issue is impacting different neighborhoods, but it also allows you to understand who the people are that are being impacted by that issue. And having that data simply helps to inform decisions that all of you are making every day. And because it's part of your engagement strategy and you're building this panel over time, having the ability to always capitalize on that audience and have it become part of your culture and your organizational approach becomes a really worthwhile thing to have as part of building strong engagement. Next. This is just one more panel that I wanted to share with you. We recently did a survey in Rochester, Minnesota relating to resident perceptions regarding the Rochester Police Department. And I put this up, not so much about the topic, but as just to give you another example of how this information is displayed on a dashboard. For those of you that use this type of a tool, this could be applicable on any topic that comes before you. And the reason why I think it's such a valuable tool, and I wish that this tool would have been available when I was managing a city, is because you really do get a better understanding as to how issues are impacting different neighborhoods and different segments of your community in a much more meaningful way. By having the ability to get these real-time verified results, it really is, it helps you with the participation, it helps you with data-formed decisions. You can track it over time, so you continually pay attention to, are you making progress on your goals that you're trying to do? It's a very effective tool for helping you achieve engagement and gathering information from a population that you probably historically have not been hearing from. So thank you for that. Next, Anthony, I'd like to, at this time, just hand over the program to Michelle to continue.
Hello, thank you. I'm now going to talk more about how to reach, how do we broaden the net to make sure those people that are extremely hard to reach or harder to reach, how we get them into community decision making. Next slide, please. And I should say, I actually started my career about 30 years ago at the city of Boulder as a researcher, and then helped form National Research Center about 25 years ago. And over the last 25 years, we worked with hundreds of local governments, foundations, nonprofits in terms of getting the voice of stakeholders and residents into organizational or community-wide decision-making. Also have done a lot of evaluations of programs intended to serve folks who are harder to reach. So pulling from that experience, we've a lot of trial and error over the years, and I just want to convey a little bit of the stuff we've learned after trying time and time again to get everything on the table. So anyways, what we do know from the studies that we do is, you know, like Matt said, everybody's a bit hard to reach nowadays, but there are some folks who we find are especially hard to reach. And what we find is often happens with local government and community decision-making. We often don't hear from those folks that are lower income, the younger residents, folks who are undocumented, people of color, and people with limited English proficiency. Those are the groups we have the hardest time getting to the table to talk with us. Next slide, please. Here's actually a sample of just survey data. And we actually at National Research Center in Polco statistically weight a lot of data to make sure we reflect the voice of folks we can't hear from. But this is a very typical thing that we see. Often we hear more from people who own their homes, people who live in detached units, white folks, white alone, not Hispanic. We also hear more commonly from older folks than younger folks, and often more from females than males. But that's who we just, time after time and community after community, that's often who we hear from and don't hear from. Next slide, please. So what are our best strategies for trying to get these folks to talk to us? And Matt talked earlier about reducing the burden. And I think that's just a key concept of all the work we've done in terms of trying to get resident and stakeholder opinion and decision making. When you make things difficult, when people have to drive across town, when they have to pay for the bus, when they have to get a babysitter, you know, even if they have to put a postage stamp on a return envelope on a survey, we know that by doing those types of things, when we make things easier, we actually are increasing the probability that someone who doesn't have as much time or as much interest might come and cooperate and partner with us. So through all these actions, I want to keep talking about the fact that we need to always think about how to minimize burden, how to fit into someone's life so that their engagement doesn't have to be an extra because we're already so busy with all the things that are going on in our frenetic schedules. So anyway, some of the strategies we think about a lot at National Research Center Polco fall into the categories of partnership, culturally relevant methods, tech, panel building, and also just demonstration of benefits and how we make sure that relationships are authentic. Next slide, please. So number one, and if I could say the thing I've learned most about doing culturally relevant outreach and evaluation over the last 30 years is partnership. All of the work we will do as a community has to be done in collaboration with all the groups we want to talk to. We can't not talk to a group of residents most of the time and then go out and say to them, hey, we want you to chime in on this issue right now. We actually need to develop that partnership early on. And so it will be used for outreach and community decision-making, but for all other types of governance or local community building. And so we often talk to folks in local government about who to reach out to. Look at your community-based organizations. I know a lot of the people on the call today are these types of organizations that should be working with local governments to partner. Schools, businesses, other government agencies who actually serve the folks that you have not been able to get to the table on their own. But starting to partner with those people to talk about not only how do we get involved in this partnership, but then how do we give information back and make sure this relationship is authentic, legitimate, and folks build trust. Next slide, please. So once we build these partnerships and they tell us how best we want to behave and engage together, we can start to then develop and work with them to develop culturally relevant practices. The number one thing that local governments often say to us, we want to translate our materials. That is, yay, important and a very important step. But translation, it has to go beyond that. And also the thing with translation we know is you really need to make sure your translation works right. We've had many experiences ourselves before there was Google Translate and stuff, hiring someone to, or even having a staff member who say they were a Mexican, native Mexican speaker to translate in Spanish, but it's going to a Costa Rican population. And we found out that wording didn't work right. We hear stories again and again. Now Google Translate doesn't do the best job. But so first of all, you need to translate and you need to make sure you have it translated from someone who's from the subgroup that you're interested in. We also, when we have these partnerships, we talk to them about how should we talk to you? Do you want us to go door to door and talk to you? Do you want to do a survey online? Do you want to have a focus group? How do you want to talk to us and communicate best? What's comfortable with your culture and with the relationship we have now? What's the preferred mode of communication? Same type of thing. And then also, what are the barriers this group experiences? Is it, if you want to talk to them in the evening, all of them have families with small children, so you'd have to provide dinner, or maybe there's bus passes that need to be delivered, or maybe we need to make sure there's an iPad that goes around. But anyways, trying to figure out what are the barriers to these folks working with us, and how can we improve that? What we also know is these barriers extend beyond just, you know, culturally relevant practices. Some of it's we're not asking in the right tools, but part of it has to do with, and probably more so, is like this kind of decreasing level of public trust we have in America, and also the real anxiety folks have over deportation and nationality, those kinds of status. And then also just a greater feeling of these folks that they're not welcome at the table, or if they come to the table, no one's going to listen to them anyways. So culturally relevant is talking about speaking to people in their language, but it's also about making them feel welcome and included. And so it's in relationship with these partners we're building, and in our actions that we're walking and talking what we do, that we start to really have this culture relevant practice. Next slide, please. So Matt talked a little bit about tech, and I know it's a concern. There's pros and cons to tech. We think more and more technology is a solution that's going to really help us get more people involved in community decision making, because the number one component I was talking about earlier is the minimization of burden. We really think technology makes it so you can spend 5 or 10 minutes with us instead of 3 hours. That helps a lot. It also, if people are using smartphones or engaged, that's what they do naturally now to communicate. So when you're meeting people where they're at, you have a higher probability of getting them to engage. It also saves resources. So it's a lot easier in terms of being green, sustainable, and also being able to forward lots of email messages on and on. We think that's really important. It's the way that kind of we're moving towards collecting more information with folks. However, we do have to think about this digital divide and who has Wi-Fi, who has technological resources, and how that impacts our populations. If you're interested in population subgroups that do not have good access to Wi-Fi or technology, you need to think about that and figure out other alternate modes of how to contact these folks. One of the things we were just talking about before this webinar started was one of the good things that might come from COVID is, you know, these new Wi-Fi hotspots, schools giving kids devices. Hopefully, one of the few good things that will come out of COVID is that we might get more people connected digitally. But once we can do that, I think that will strengthen our approach. The other thing I love about technology when it comes to talking to groups who are non-traditionally coming to local government to help make decisions is it gives us the ability to kind of use a snowball effect, which is you send out an invitation or put something on social media to a certain person, they can send it out to more people, they can send it out to more people. So if you can actually put out and do outreach into the groups and get it into the right people's hands, you have a much bigger presence than in the old days when I used to have to like call all the faith-based communities in a community and go drop off surveys so they could hand them out to their congregations and I pick them back up. So it gives us an opportunity to get like these small subgroups of people forwarding information and getting them all involved. So there's great potential, but again, you need to go back to the steps of who you're trying to get involved into your community, your decision-making process, and what kinds of tech do they have right now, and how does that look next year and in 2 years. Next slide, please. The other thing we do, and this is kind of a survey research jargon, but the concept is important. And like, and what it means is oversampling people we know aren't gonna respond to us. So in a survey, a mailed out survey, what we'll often do is instead of sending the same number of surveys to everywhere in the community, we might actually oversample or send more surveys to people in rental units, because we know rental units tend to encompass a lot of the folks that don't talk to us as much. So we may send 3 times the amount of surveys to people in rental units. Or we may look at census tracts and look at the folks and trying to figure out what demographic or socioeconomic information we want. We might send out more outreach in that area. And this doesn't have to be in terms of mailed out, but it could be in any types of effort, whether you want posters or postcards or social media outreaches, if you work on Nextdoor, thinking about areas where folks you don't hear from exist, trying to spend more effort or energy towards that group. And the planning Matt talked about is really important to this, of making sure you're intentional and that you may be lending more resources to certain groups instead of maybe the resources you might spend towards attracting white, middle-aged, male and female homeowners, because we know those folks are gonna come to the table more easily. Next slide. Here's just an example of a map you might look at and identify, like in these red areas, we have, say, more folks that are Hispanic in this area, or more people that live or might be not speaking English as a first language. we might spend different kinds of communications or spend more resources towards those folks to help us make sure we balance the representation of our community. Next slide, please. And then the final idea we have, and Matt talked about this with Polco, and it's kind of the role of Polco, the digital engagement platform, is to really start building a panel. One of the things we've learned from the private sector is that it's much harder to get someone to talk to you in the first place, but once you get them to talk to you, it's kind of easier to maintain that relationship if you do a good job. And so our thoughts, and we've been thinking about this a lot the last years in terms of getting folks involved in government decision-making, is trying to build a panel of folks. You do the hard part, trying to get them recruited. But once you get them on a panel, asking them to spend 10, 20 minutes per month to actually engage with you in terms of questions, discussions. And then you build that over time. You can monitor your diversity, make sure you're getting the folks you want. If not, do extra recruiting in those areas. But also those folks, then it kind of establishes this relationship we're talking about, partnership, because not only if you have them on a panel and you have some contact information, you can ask them different questions about community decision-making that you want to move forward on, but also you can actually send them updates and say, the report's done, here's what it said, or here's the report and this is what we've done with your information, because folks don't want to just be included as this kind of like topic, or just a piece that we just want to say we did outreach to. They actually want to know that the time they spent with you is meaningful and that you actually are in a relationship. So the more we can build this relationship into the whole outreach instead of just one-time distribution out, the more successful we're going to be. Next slide, please. And there again is like, there's a slide from Polco, but this is showing for the city of Appleton, Wisconsin, just how many people they have on their panel, where they're from, age, gender, but you can track stuff and then you can look at it and say, oh my gosh, we don't have nearly enough 18 to 29-year-olds, or we don't have enough, folks who speak Spanish, or however you decide to track information. But you can then go out and make more outreach so that you make sure that your panel for your decision-making for your community or organization represents the folks that you intend. Next slide, please. So in terms of summary of trying to tap into these folks we don't traditionally get at the table, number one, like I said, really lower those participation barriers. Figure out what's the barrier and figure out how to remove that so that it's easy and simple. Create a plan, use culturally relevant practices, again, deciding those in combination with partners and people who really understand are part of that population. Oversample or do more resources to the groups who are more reluctant. If you can, capitalize on technology or plan for that in the future. Consider building a panel. And like, again, it's this partnership, this authentic relationship that's going to be really important. So it's important that you demonstrate the benefit back. So whenever you have someone you ask to partner with them, make sure they understand what you're doing, how you're using the information, and how your community is different because these folks actually chose to help participate. Next slide. So now I'm going to move into some of the topics we've been working with on Polco the last few months with COVID and some of the Black Lives Matter area and community equity inclusion. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you, what topic would you like to discuss in your community or organization right now? If you could ask some questions, what topic would you talk about? And you can type that into the chat box.
Go ahead and read out some of these as they come in. We have food access, early childhood education, voter registration and education, access to essential services, particularly in the face of COVID-related challenges, immigrant rights, needs for educational support, access to housing. Anti-Blackness and racial justice, entrepreneurship in the COVID-19 era, strategies for effective activism,
it sounds like there's lots of topics. Like we said, if you think about it, there's a myriad topics we could discuss with the people who are stakeholders every day. So I'm going to focus now a little bit on what we've been doing. A lot of the communities we work, the kind of questions they've been interested in asking since March. Okay. Next slide, please. So like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about COVID because that's been the topic on most people's minds. We have some information on community policing and also the community equity and inclusion. Those are some of the things that the local governments and communities we've been working with have been really interested in right now. Next slide, please. So in terms of COVID-19, what we're finding is that COVID-19 affects all the elements of community livability that we often study and care about, and as folks who are interested in building community play a role in. And so economic impacts, safety impacts, health and wellness impacts, education, arts, culture, almost every area it's impacting it. The natural environment, there might actually good. So there are a few areas that are seeing some boons, but most areas are being hit negatively by COVID-19, and inclusivity engagement is one of those. People not being able to connect it, with each other. The mental health, social health of our country is not great right now in a lot of communities. And so it's important that we're able to measure some of this stuff and try to figure out where and how to make these decisions that are so complicated these days where we're doing so many trade-offs. Next slide, please. This actually, we've been doing some surveys more recently on opening of the community, reopening, and what pace and what things should need to be put into place and how comfortable people feel about reopening their communities. So here's a question where we ask folks to tell us, how do they feel about the speed of the reopening of their economy based on their city, their county, their state? And you'll see that people are more satisfied with the way their cities have been handling it rather than state. Next slide, please. Some other questions, asking folks about what is their concerns about reopening. So is it the health and safety of vulnerable populations, the health of their family, overwhelming the medical facilities? And at the same time, how concerned are they about the loss of locally owned small businesses, a recession, and unemployment? So that policymakers and people trying to decide about the community and what's best for it can take into account what are the things that their residents need and what kind of decisions would be best to make given everybody's current concerns and situations. And next slide, please. And here's one more question on community reopening. Here's one where we ask the residents how comfortable they are with certain types of businesses being open, and asking them if they should be open no matter what, open with rules or not open. And again, these types of questions, asking community residents how they feel about these different types of businesses being open, can help those in charge of the community and actually local businesses themselves figure out their strategies for the upcoming months and how that reopening is going to look. Next slide. And so in COVID, we also do a lot of surveys about health and economic and mental health status, trying to monitor those over time to see if communities, if health's up, what's happening economically, what's happening with people's mental health. We're also just about to do a survey about school reopenings and trying to figure out how people feel about reopening and what things need to be in place. I'm trying to help a lot of the school districts and communities make some decisions around how to reopen their schools. So COVID is going to continue to be very interesting, and we're going to continue to want to probably engage our residents over time in terms of how we make these trade-offs between important community segments and look at how it impacts different groups, the economy and the community differently. Now we'll talk about community policing. At National Research Center Polco, we've been looking at the relationships between police and communities for many years. And in the last years, noticed those relationships starting to decline a bit. So we developed a survey to really try to measure how residents feel about police and sheriff and then the crime in their communities. And so I'm going to give you some results from our national survey we do. Next slide, please. So this actually is specific to a community, but it's the type of questions we ask in the survey. We ask residents to rate their, it's kind of their public trust in officers and how their officers and police do at treating residents fairly, protecting civil rights, holding officers accountable. But we ask residents across the nation and in communities to answer these questions about how they feel about their police and sheriff services. Next slide, please. We also ask them if they've had contact with police. So in our national survey, we found about 50% of people have had contact with the police or sheriff department in the past month. And we asked them why, just so we can look at the reasons why to see if that varies. And then next slide. And then for those who have had contact with their police and sheriff, we asked them to rate the officer or the staff member on these different pieces of information. Now this was in 2018, it's from this national data. We're actually redoing the survey right now. And what we found is in most communities, most of the cops are getting good ratings. About 20% not so good, but about 80% of the folks are rating the cops positively on a number of their behaviors. Next slide. But what's really interesting in this, and in all the studies that we do, particularly if you're folks interested in inclusivity and equity, is looking at the difference in perceptions based on your background. And so in the next couple of slides, we will show you the differences we have from our national panel data based on white resident and Black resident opinions and how they differ. And what we found on one of the sets of questions on the survey, we really asked people about their biggest crime issues in their communities. And what we found overall is actually they're pretty similar for whites and Black residents about their ratings. Where we find that Black residents give higher ratings of problems is school safety, gun violence, litter, and homeless transient problems. We see that white folks rate issues more problematic in terms of fraud and identity and financial crimes against the elderly. But again, generally these lines look pretty similar. Next slide, please. But when we look at the trust in the police and the residents' perceptions of how the police behave, we see much bigger differences between white and Black residents in terms of how well they treat them, treat residents fairly, officers holding themselves accountable, using appropriate force, being trustworthy. We see those gaps there, and we see those gaps playing out right now in the last month or two here in America, seeing how these differences are pretty significant. And we think this is important for communities to know at their own level besides just the national level. And then final slide on our policing data is we actually asked them about their priorities moving forward. And what we found again is they're, I'm sorry, my thing. Sorry, I thought I had that turned off. What we find with the priorities is, again, the white and Black residents are more in line with their priorities, kind of showing that in terms of community problems and priorities, we're kind of on the same team. But when it comes to officer conduct and public trust, that's where we're awry. So these kinds of data can kind of give us a sense of where we can work as a community to align perceptions so that all folks feel the same levels of trust, even though we share a lot of the same experiences in our community. Next slide, please. And then finally, the work we've been doing on community equity and inclusion is very common these last month or so, probably related a lot to the community policing issues, but communities are really trying to find out how welcoming and how inclusive their communities are. Next slide, please. So here's some of the questions we've been posting recently. You can see on the right-hand side, here's the kind of questions we have folks asking the residents, asking them how good their community is on the following. Are they good about valuing residents from diverse backgrounds, by respecting individual cultural beliefs and values, providing equal access to housing? We ask residents to complete the survey. And again, similar to what we're doing with the policing survey, we can break those data by resident backgrounds. Here's one of my favorite questions on the survey, and we ask folks how welcoming their community is for people of all different types. So for people who are younger, who are older, who are white, who are Black, who are the languages English is their first language, people who are not. And what we do is we break those data to show how welcoming everybody, first of all, how welcoming everyone in the community thinks, but then also how welcoming do people think the community is for US citizens if you are US citizens and if you're not. And it's those disparities and those gaps that's really interesting besides the data overall. And so if you want to look at your community, how well you're doing, you can get an overall number of how everyone thinks, but also really can look at those disparities and understanding where the gaps in empathy or understanding exist is a really great tool for people moving forward in terms of becoming a more equitable and inclusive community. So that's, again, that's the Community Equity and Inclusion Survey that we offer on Polco too, and just kind of the work we do that we think is important in terms of trying to at least get a baseline and understand where communities are, so that when they plan programs and try to move forward, we can actually kind of track that over time to see if they're making a difference. Next slide, please. So that's all I wanted to talk about. I'm going to turn it back over to Matt to give you some more information.
Thanks, Michelle. That was great. We want to put this slide up because this is one of the, let me turn my video on, I'm sorry. This is one of the exciting things that I mentioned at the start of the program. Welcoming America and Polco have been developing this relationship over the course of the last year. And as we started to push out the equity and inclusion questions, we were able to actually put together a partnership agreement that enables all of its members to have access to those questions. Those questions are going to become part of one of our features that communities and organizations need to purchase at some point in the future. But based on the partnership that we're developing, they will Welcoming America members will have access to all of these questions. And so I would encourage you to think about going to polco.us and getting your community platform set up. Anyone can get access to a free Polco platform. It's available for everyone to use and purchase the features that you want to have. The uniqueness of this relationship is that we're discounting that pricing for members of Welcoming America and making the equity and inclusion survey questions available. One of the really neat things that we're going to be rolling out probably within the next month is with all of the virtual meetings that are going on, we have something that's called Virtual Live, where you'll actually be able to engage with your members virtually during meetings. And I'm thinking of council meetings or public meetings that are currently being handled remotely. And the value of that, of course, is that Facebook Live and the chat that we are using today, they're useful, but they don't organize the information. And so Polco Live will actually allow you to be able to post questions and get that organized and verified information simply by refreshing your screen. So we're excited about that. And then finally, the partnership does provide benefits to the organization itself, so that as they're engaging with their members on organizational issues, they'll have access to a lot of those benefits as well. So take advantage of it if you like. We think that it's really going to be a great partnership. One of the reasons why I'm really intrigued about it is, I come from 30 years as a city manager, and so the importance and challenge of making new residents feel welcome really is dependent upon the local leadership and the local community having a better understanding as to what those gaps are and where the needs are. And I think that the questions that are now available to all of the members will certainly help you to think strategically about those things you can do in your own communities to make your communities more welcome. So with that, I will hand the screen back to Melissa for questions.
Thanks, Matt. And again, just really want to say that we are really excited about this partnership with Polco. And I think one of the things that's really great about it is that there are different levels that you can access it at. And so, there's the free version, which you can just use and play around with. And then as a Welcoming Network member, we also have some additional benefits for all of you. So really excited about that. But we have about 10 minutes now for questions. We've gotten quite a few in the chat already. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple of them. One of the first questions that we got in the chat was really about balancing input from those residents that are most impacted with input from all residents. And so question, how do you do that balance, recognizing that, all community members are essentially impacted, but there are some that have a higher impact. So how do you balance that input in decision making?
I can answer just from what I know when I worked, and Matt may have some more to say, but I know we used to, when I first worked at the city of Boulder and we started doing survey research, we started asking the people who came to meetings and called their council members what their opinions were. And then we also did a survey of the population at the same time. And even with the survey where it's not 100% representation, we found the people who actually answered the surveys that took 5 minutes instead of attending a council meeting or making you call or email your council meeting, their opinions were not as diverse or strong. So they may have had the same leanings, but they were not nearly as strong and angry usually, or positive. So they weren't people who had so much to gain or lose. They happen to be more typical and representative. So this lowering of the participation or the burden is, for me, one of the biggest keys of not getting folks that are the most impacted, because what we know, and if you've gone to council meeting or town meetings, the people who show up are the people who have the most to lose often. And so it's good to hear from those folks, but at the same time, if it's the best thing for the community overall, we need to hear from all those folks. So I would say lowering participation, finding ways to reach out to folks so they know that their opinion is really important. That's one of the best ways to balance that. And Matt, I don't know if you want to say something else.
Well, the only thing I would add is that one of the neat things about Polco, we all recognize that engagement takes on many forms. And the more information that you are able to gather from your residents, the more able you are to identify those groups that are going to be more impacted or not. So using Polco as a tool for engagement allows you to actually build a broader audience. And because it's an iterative process, you're able to continue to ask questions to kind of glean more into who are those folks that are the most impacted. And then that data, of course, just simply helps you to evaluate what that particular issue is. And I think the broader the audience that's participating, the more useful and the more helpful it's going to be to help you understand whether or not there are certain impact issues that you're going to need to be contending with and trying to find a resolution to.
And I would say too, I really valued when I worked for the city of Boulder, we would have folks, for instance, that would say, everything has to be about bikes. And I love bikes. So I'm not saying it, but they would make every decision about bikes. If I would do a survey and get my results back and say, yeah, people do care about bikes, but you know, if they care about X, Y, and Z, those folks who are like kind of the radical bike enthusiasts, they actually listened to the data too, because they thought the only people they heard from were also people who are bike enthusiasts. But it was good for them to understand that they weren't the only people in the community, and that the transportation we had to make had to help with bikes, but also there were people who wanted to still use the bus. There were people who wanted to walk. And so I think that data can be used to defend decisions, but it also can be used to engage those folks who are kind of single issue identity, you know, they just really revolve around a single issue, having those folks understand the opinions of other folks in the community so it can be inclusive throughout.
Great. Thanks so much. Another question that we got in is how do you incorporate qualitative data in with the quantitative data and use that to inform decision making?
We've talked about for 30 years, I've been thinking about this and struggling with this issue. Qualitative data provides so much depth. We think of quantitative data a little bit more, I mean, a breadth, but what we know is like database decision making is a little bit better based on the quantitative. We can get more people to participate, because often to do qualitative is more cognitively burdensome. Even an open-ended question versus a fixed choice question is harder for someone to answer. That doesn't mean we don't do it, but what we find works the best is a combination. And so you use survey questions or some quantitative data to get a response from everybody, but then you can dig deeper. So we use some open-ended questions, we use focus groups, we use these to augment the quantitative. But if you use qualitative only and not quantitative, sometimes you may end up not understanding the issue completely, because the people who are willing to come to a focus group, a meeting, or spend lots of time answering open-ended questions, they're maybe different than the folks who don't have the time to do it. So the best approach, we think, is to kind of do combination. And what I would say in the past, we often would do like a survey, broad survey of the population, but we might do focus groups with groups, say, we still do this, like Somali refugees. They're not going to, they've already told us they don't want to answer survey, it's too difficult for them. We may go out and do like a qualitative outreach to some group that really does not want to participate in a more Western way of evaluation. And we've done that and we augment it, but we always make sure there's a quantitative portion if we can, if we want it to be really database decision making.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Another question that was asked is if you have resources or suggestions on developing surveys. And I guess that's, I mean, kind of maybe a question too, as far as what does Polco offer in that, in the platform, as far as also accessing survey, but just generally suggestions about survey development, and then specifically for the platform.
Well, what's great about, oh, Matt, you can.
No, go ahead and talk about.
I was going to say, we actually, part of the Polco, we have a library that has all kinds of documents on how to do things, but we also do webinars. And one of the webinars I've done is Survey Construction 101. And it's basically going over all the pitfalls I've seen people made over the last 30 years and the best ways to fix those and how to write questions. And we also, so we continue to add those resources to our library. We have the webinars, we have white papers, but we also put out surveys and recommended question sets that folks can emulate and alter, because people think that it's really easy to create a survey, but it's not. And it's especially if you want it to be unbiased and neutral and non-offensive, it takes some work. So we do a lot of work at Polco to help you have the right resources to create the right questions, or use our resources to do it. Matt, do you want to add something?
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to add is that we have developed a Polco library, which is a depository of questions that have been asked by communities probably over the last 2.5 decades. And we recognize that sometimes communities just need to have a framework of a question to help with orienting it around a topic that they're dealing with. And so it's a resource that's available to folks who are on the Polco platform.
Great. I think I'm just gonna, we have time for maybe one more question. And this is really more kind of, I guess, in the nuanced area of if this question was asked at the beginning of the webinar, really when we were looking at some of the breakdown of like demographic information and all of that. And so I think it's really referring to understanding if the data is so comprehensive, like how does that then impact the participant's ability to fill it out? Does it make it more complicated? What are some of those balances that you decide when creating a survey as far as how many questions to ask regarding demographic information?
Well, we can help provide guidance to communities and organizations that are using the platform on strategically how to do the outreach. And there certainly are tools online as well. So we'll work with those folks. The value of the demographic information, though, in my mind, is that it gives you a much deeper level of understanding as to who's being impacted and how your community is being impacted by that particular issue. The demographic collection is done in the background. There are cases where we do self-reporting, and that just simply helps to enhance the data that we're getting. But it really is intended to provide decision makers information that historically they just haven't had access to. It's really helping communities to be more data driven in their decision making. It's just information, and leaders need to take a look at it and consider how it is that it's going to be handled in the context of the issue they're confronting. But it's information that they currently are not receiving, and so it just becomes a very valuable resource.
And there are we have ways, and you can see if you get on our platform, of how you introduce the demographic section if we're going to ask those questions. But we always encourage folks, if you're going to ask demographic questions, that you use it. Don't ask demographic questions just for fun. It would be something you'd want to compare the responses by later, or you need to look at the representation. But again, there's ways to make people understand that it's going to be reported in group form only. It's completely confidential. We're only using it to break the responses. But there's ways to make people feel more comfortable about how you ask those questions. And also the order, if you end up getting on Polco and watching the webinar we give on, survey questions 101, the number one thing I always say is don't start with the demographic questions. Everybody likes to start surveys with that because they think they're easiest to answer, but they're also threatening. And so people need to understand that demographic questions, if you're going to ask them on a survey, need to go to the end. And you don't put income at the very first. So like there's some skills in terms of getting people to answer surveys and not make them feel threatened and make them feel safe.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle and Matt. So on behalf of Welcoming America and all of our attendees, I would really like to thank you for a wonderful presentation this afternoon. Our webinar has been recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording so that you can revisit the content today. If you have any questions, please send an email to events@welcomingamerica.org, and we will respond to you as soon as possible. Lastly, please take a moment to complete the post-webinar survey that you will see when we close today. Your responses are important to us and will help us ensure future webinars provide you with the information you need. So again, on behalf of everyone at Welcoming America and our speakers today, I'd like to thank you for your time. Have a great rest of your day.